She stood at the threshold of the family hall, her hand lightly brushing the carved frame of the door, the cool wood smooth under her fingertips. The room stretched before her, vast and imposing, every ornate pillar and gleaming surface a reflection of the family's power and stature. The candles on the long table flickered, their warm glow casting fleeting shadows across the tapestries lining the walls, each depicting the family's proud history. But as she stood there, the silence of the room seemed to thicken, like a shroud she couldn't escape. Her eye swept the space, noting the careful arrangements of the furniture, the perfectly placed offerings, the positions at the table. Everything had its designated place, including her own absence. She had long stopped taking her seat at the head, no longer invited to join the important discussions. There was no space left for her among them, not in the center of this world, not in this life. Her fingers tightened against the doorframe, but she made no sound, no movement. The quiet resignation had settled inside her like a weight she couldn't lift, like an invisible chain pulling her further away from the heart of the family. Her memories stirred, as vivid and sharp as the distant sounds of her childhood. She recalled a time, long ago, when her voice had been heard, when her laughter had filled the halls with promise. A time when her father's approval had been a coveted thing, and the family's eyes, warm with affection, had been upon her. But that was before the whispers, before the subtle glances exchanged behind closed doors, before the shift in the air that had grown heavier with each passing year. Slowly, imperceptibly, the warmth had faded, replaced by the cold walls of indifference. She remembered the first time she realized she no longer belonged. It had been a simple thing, a gesture unnoticed by most. Her father, sitting at the head of the family gathering, had spoken to her half-sister with the kindest words, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder, while she was dismissed with a nod, her presence barely acknowledged. It had felt like the ground beneath her had shifted, the foundation of her identity cracking just enough for her to notice the change. The once lively discussions about the future of the family, her role within it, had become nothing more than fleeting afterthoughts. She wasn't needed anymore. In the quiet corners of the house, she had overheard the servants whispering, their voices lowered, as they discussed the household's inner workings, the birthright that had been promised to her but was quietly given away to others, the privileges that had been hers by birthright but were slowly being stripped away. The empty, hollow words of kindness and politeness that danced around her like a cruel performance. But she had learned to stay silent, to hold her tongue, to play her part in the family's play, to smile when she was ignored, to nod when her efforts were overlooked. The more she tried to fit herself into the role they wanted her to play, the more she felt herself slipping away, like sand between her fingers. She closed her eyes for a moment, her breath shallow as the memories of that feeling, of being overlooked and discarded, pressed down on her chest. Her body, once held upright with pride, now sagged under the weight of this unspoken truth. No one had ever said it outright, but she knew she was no longer a part of the center, no longer someone whose presence mattered. The realization hit her like a cold wave, sweeping through every fiber of her being. She was nothing more than a ghost in this house, an unwelcome shadow that lingered long after the light had moved on. She inhaled deeply, steadying herself against the doorframe as if the world itself had become too heavy to bear. For the first time in years, she let herself feel the weight of her displacement, the humiliation of being made invisible, the sting of knowing that her place in the family had been silently erased. The memories that once gave her strength now felt like chains, binding her to a past where she was still someone to be reckoned with, a place she could never return to. But as the silence stretched on, as she stood there in the dim light of the hallway, something began to shift within her. A subtle crack in the facade she had built around herself, a flicker of awareness that began to burn slowly within her chest. She was not the ghost they had made her. She was still here, still breathing, still capable of something more than just survival. She took a single step away from the door, her resolve hardening with each movement. The time for silence was over. Her place, her legacy, she would take them back. She was done being pushed to the margins of this family. It was time for her to claim what was rightfully hers. She walked into the family's main hall, her presence no longer commanding the attention it once had. The servants, bustling as they always did, glanced at her, then quickly turned their eyes away, pretending not to notice. The long, wooden table was set with delicate porcelain cups, each filled with steaming tea. The intricate pattern on the tablecloth seemed to mock her, everything in its place, everything arranged with perfect symmetry, except for the seat she no longer occupied at the head of the table. Her place had been moved, subtly but unmistakably, to the far end of the table, beside a half-empty chair, as though she were an afterthought. The conversation around her swirled in polite, formal exchanges, as the family members spoke in carefully measured tones. The sound of their laughter, forced and strained, echoed off the high ceilings, but she felt no warmth in it, only the cold reality of being a stranger in her own home. She took her seat, folding her hands neatly in her lap, keeping her back straight, as if to convince herself that she was still a part of this world, still worthy of being here. The matriarch, as always, sat at the center, her eyes sharp, as though she could see right through the act. The others, her siblings, sat around her like satellites, orbiting her power without question. Their faces were masks of polite interest, but the distance between them and her was palpable. Not one of them made eye contact, not one of them acknowledged her presence beyond the bare minimum required by family etiquette. Her tea was served last, as it always was now, and even then, it came without the grace it once had. The servant's hands were quick, efficient, but there was no lingering glance, no hint of respect in the gesture. She accepted the cup with a nod, the porcelain cool against her fingers, and took a sip. It was bitter, as if reflecting the taste in her mouth, her life in the family, once sweet with promise, now tainted by the aftertaste of neglect. The conversation continued around her, but she was no longer a part of it. She was a listener, a shadow at the table, her words held back by the invisible force that had always kept her at the periphery. Her father, the patriarch of the family, sat at the head, his voice booming with authority, but even he seemed to avoid meeting her gaze. When he addressed the family, it was always to the others, her half-siblings, her cousins, but never to her. The years had taught her to smile and nod, to accept her place, however diminished it had become. But today, as she sat there, watching the movements around her with eyes that had long since learned the art of silent observation, she felt the weight of her own insignificance more keenly than ever. The matriarch's voice broke through the air, commanding attention with a sharpness that sliced through the conversation. She spoke to her eldest son, asking his opinion on some trivial matter, but the words held more than mere politeness. She was testing him, as always, to see if he was worthy of his position, to ensure that he was the one who would inherit her favor, her legacy. The heroine lowered her gaze to her tea, her fingers trembling slightly as the cup rested on the saucer. She remembered the years when it had been her name that her father had called out, when the decisions had been made with her in mind, when her opinion had held weight. That was before the quiet shifts had begun, before her half-sister's marriage had been arranged, her father's favor given to her brother, the subtle manipulation of words and gestures that had slowly pushed her aside. She wasn't angry. Anger was too loud, too obvious. She had learned to contain it, to wear the mask of acceptance, even as it cut her deeper with each passing year. Her place at the table, once central, now felt distant, cold. The rules of the house had shifted, the dynamics of the family recalibrated, but no one ever spoke of it. Instead, they pretended, playing their roles in a well-rehearsed drama where she no longer had a part. Her mind wandered back to that first moment, the moment she had been quietly displaced, when she had realized that her seat was no longer where it once was. It had been a simple thing, the way her father had leaned forward to praise her sister's accomplishments, while her own efforts had gone unnoticed. The silence had been deafening in that room, as if the air itself had frozen, refusing to allow her to exist in the space where she had once belonged. And then there was the subtle shift in the way the servants moved around her. The offerings, once given with respect, were now handed with indifference. The household had learned to ignore her, to pretend that she was no longer a part of their world. It was an unspoken rule, one that had been established quietly, over time, but now it was clear, she was no longer welcome in the center of the family's power. She swallowed the bitter tea, feeling the warmth spread through her, but it did little to ease the cold that had settled in her chest. Her presence in the hall, in this family, felt like a shadow, a forgotten remnant of a time when things were different. She had been erased, not with force, but with subtlety, and it had taken her a long time to recognize it. The years had worn her down, made her believe that this was her place, that she deserved nothing more than what was given to her. But as she sat there, her fingers tightening around the delicate cup, she realized that she had accepted this fate for far too long. She was no longer a passive observer of her own life. The mask she wore, the role she played, had become too tight, too suffocating. She had played the part of the quiet daughter, the invisible woman, for long enough. It was time to let go of the illusion, to reclaim the space that had been stolen from her. Slowly, imperceptibly, she stood. The soft rustling of her robes was the only sound in the otherwise silent hall. She did not make a scene. She did not demand attention. She simply walked, her steps measured, controlled, as if the very act of moving was an assertion of her own existence. She did not look back. As she crossed the threshold of the hall, leaving behind the well-dressed shadows of her family, she felt the weight of her position lift, if only for a moment. The mask had cracked, and for the first time in years, she allowed herself to feel something more than the cold, suffocating indifference of her family's expectations. The memory surfaced like a quiet ripple on the surface of a stagnant pond. She remembered the day of the family's grand banquet, an event meant to celebrate the union of two noble houses, the joining of fates through marriage, an occasion that had been meticulously prepared for weeks. She had been younger then, a time when the warmth of the household still lingered, or so she had believed. Her father had promised her that she would stand at his side during the ceremony, that her presence would be a part of the moment that sealed the bond. The entire estate had been transformed into a palace of silk and gold, and the air had been thick with the scent of incense and jasmine, as though they were breathing in the very essence of power and wealth. Yet, when the moment came, when the guests had gathered in the grand hall, her place had not been where she had imagined. She stood near the back, unnoticed, a silent observer of the ceremonial proceedings unfolding before her. As the guests took their seats, her father had called upon her elder sister, the one whose legitimacy was unquestioned, to stand beside him at the head of the table, to be the one to offer the first toast. Her name, when spoken, was like a phantom, only briefly mentioned before being swallowed by the greater current of the celebration. Her seat, now relegated to the farthest end of the hall, felt like the shadow of her former place. She recalled how she had stood there, feeling the weight of the room press down on her, as the voices around her blurred into background noise. She had tried to smile, to blend in, but the discomfort had gnawed at her insides, like an itch she couldn't reach. The family had been there, all of them, wrapped in their own worlds, and yet no one had noticed her standing alone. The servants moved around her as if she were invisible, offering drinks, arranging the seating, their eyes glancing past her without a flicker of recognition. Her father's gaze had not once strayed in her direction. She had been forgotten. In that moment, the idea that her place in the family was a secure one had crumbled like dust in her fingers. She could feel it, the subtle shift, the small yet significant gesture of exclusion that no one would speak of aloud. It was in the way her name had been brushed aside, in the way her presence had been considered unnecessary in the face of others' importance. It was in the smile her mother had given her half-sister, the quiet, approving glance that had lingered a moment too long, the sort of attention that she had once enjoyed but had been denied for far too long. The toast had been raised by her sister, and as the room clapped, she had lowered her head, forcing herself to remain composed. The sting of it, however, had already seeped deep into her chest, burrowing itself into the corners of her mind where it would remain, silent but sharp, for years to come. No words had been exchanged between them, no overt action had been taken, but the message was clear: she was no longer a part of this family's core. Her place had been quietly reassigned, and no one had bothered to explain why. It had been a silent betrayal, a shifting of allegiances that had gone unnoticed by most, but for her, it marked the moment when she truly realized that her standing in the family had been diminished. The whispers that followed had been even worse. She had overheard them, as she had often done when she wandered through the house alone. The servants, ever eager to share the latest news, spoke of her absence from the forefront of the family's power. They mentioned her father's increasing favoritism toward her older sister, the one with the more prestigious bloodline. They spoke of her being passed over for roles she had once filled with pride, overseeing the household affairs, managing the family's resources, but now, it was her sister who was entrusted with such duties. The small actions, the small shifts, no one spoke of them directly, but they were enough to make her feel the invisible wall that separated her from the others. She had once believed she could claim her rightful place, that her presence in the family was solid and unshakable. But over time, those around her had begun to see her as a mere shadow of what she once was, a relic of a time when she had been more than just a secondary figure. The banquet ended, and the guests filed out, their laughter fading into the night. She had lingered for a moment, staring at the empty seats, the space where her presence had once been central, before quietly retreating to her quarters. It was there, alone in the dim light of her room, that she allowed herself the luxury of feeling the pain. But even then, she said nothing, made no sound. She had learned long ago that there was no place for her to express her hurt, no one who would understand. So, she kept it inside, buried beneath a mask of calm, a mask she wore to survive in this house. As she sat on her bed, staring out of the window at the moonlight that bathed the courtyard in a cold glow, the realization settled in her heart. She had been quietly cast aside, pushed into the margins of the family, and no one had acknowledged it. It wasn't just the banquet, it was the culmination of years of small betrayals, small gestures of exclusion, all adding up to this moment. She had been replaced. Her value had been diminished in the eyes of those who should have cared for her most. And yet, she stayed silent. The family would never know the true weight of what had been done to her, nor the quiet sacrifice she had made to keep the peace. But as the night stretched on, something within her stirred. The mask she had worn for so long, the mask of acceptance, began to crack. The family was gathered once more in the great hall, the space filled with the soft hum of conversation and the clinking of fine porcelain. It was another occasion, one of many, that had become all too familiar, the yearly offering to the family ancestors, a ceremonial display of respect, and a calculated opportunity to showcase power and status. She stood beside the doorway, her hands clasped in front of her, the weight of the years pressing on her shoulders, her heart steady but heavy. The guests, members of the extended family, arrived and took their seats. The servants moved swiftly, laying out dishes, their eyes avoiding hers as they set the table, making no effort to acknowledge her beyond the barest of necessities. She could feel the absence of warmth, the cold professionalism in every glance they cast her way. No one spoke her name, no one sought her presence, though she was, by blood, the daughter of the family. The moment arrived, and as always, her father took his place at the head of the table, his authority palpable in the way the room fell silent when he entered. His eyes, sharp and calculating, swept over the gathered family, pausing just long enough to give a slight nod of recognition to her half-sister, the one who had come to replace her at the center of the household. A seat had been reserved for her beside him, a place that should have been hers. She did not make a scene. Instead, she took her position at the far end of the table, quietly accepting the space they had left for her. As the proceedings continued, the servants brought forward the offerings to the ancestors, and once again, the careful choreography of the ceremony unfolded with its rituals and respect. Yet, the way the family members interacted, the way they spoke to each other, was a clear reminder of how far removed she had become from the heart of the house. Her father's voice boomed with practiced warmth as he spoke to her half-sister, offering praises for her contributions to the family's well-being, her wisdom in overseeing the estate. The words were carefully chosen, designed to lift her higher, to solidify her place in the family hierarchy. It was a quiet moment, the subtle manipulation of affection and approval, but it spoke louder to her than any overt gesture ever could. Her half-sister smiled, gracious and poised, her eyes gleaming with the satisfaction of being recognized, of being placed in the spotlight where she belonged. She did not see the way her father's gaze avoided her, did not hear the silence that followed the absence of her name. Her heart clenched, but she remained still, offering a small, polite smile, pretending as if it did not matter. She had learned to mask her emotions, to wear the mask of compliance that had been handed to her so many years ago. The dinner continued, and as the last course was served, a strange tension settled in the air. The matriarch, who had long been the silent power behind the family's actions, turned her gaze to her. It was a calculated look, one that suggested approval, but there was something in it that felt more like a dismissal. She could feel the weight of the matriarch's eyes on her, but it was not the warmth of a parent's gaze, it was the gaze of someone who was measuring her worth, someone who had already decided where she belonged in this family. The matriarch spoke, her words directed to her, but the tone was not one of respect. It was the same tone she used with the servants, with those she considered beneath her. "You've done well to keep the peace," the matriarch said, her voice smooth, but her words carrying a subtle sting. "Your restraint is admirable." The praise was hollow, an acknowledgement of her silence, her subservience, but nothing more. She nodded, her hands trembling slightly as she sipped the tea placed before her. The cup, once an offering of welcome, now felt like a symbol of her place within the family, small, insignificant, and held at arm's length. Her mother, who had once been a pillar of support, did not look her way. Instead, she spoke in soft tones to her half-sister, their exchange private and unhurried. The words they shared, though spoken softly, were laced with meaning, as if she had been replaced not only in status but in affection as well. She could no longer pretend. She had been pushed aside, her presence relegated to the background, her importance minimized in the face of those who now commanded the family's attention. But even in that quiet corner of the hall, in the cold silence that followed each of her attempts to reassert her place, she did not speak out. She had learned long ago that there was no point in raising her voice. No one would listen. The food had been served, the offerings made, the guests had praised each other's accomplishments, and yet, in the midst of all the rituals and formality, she could not shake the feeling that something had been taken from her. It wasn't just the ceremonial gestures, the words that had passed her by. It was the absence of her name in the family's story, the quiet erasure of her existence from the narrative that once included her. When the evening drew to a close, and the guests began to leave, she remained behind, standing at the window, watching as the family members made their way out, talking amongst themselves as if nothing had changed. But something inside her had shifted. The weight of years of subtle manipulation, of quiet exclusion, had finally begun to settle fully in her chest. And still, she remained silent, a phantom at the edge of the family's life, watching as they continued without her. In the quiet darkness of the hall, she took one last look around, the familiar, cold room, the high ceilings, the walls that once had borne witness to her laughter, now silent and indifferent. As the candles flickered, casting long shadows across the floor, she realized that she had been erased from the family's future. But it was not the end. No, it was only the beginning of something she had long ignored. The space they had left for her was no longer enough. And in the quietest of moments, she could almost hear the stirrings of her own rebellion, not in the form of a scream, but in the silent decision to no longer accept what they had given her. The days following the banquet were quieter, but the silence seemed heavier now, suffocating in its weight. She moved through the corridors of the estate with the same practiced grace, her eyes downcast, avoiding any unnecessary contact. The servants still looked through her, the distance palpable in their every glance, their voices murmuring just out of reach. But it was no longer the same. The truth had begun to crystallize in her mind, a painful clarity that she could not ignore. The family's treatment of her, the cold indifference, the subtle exclusions, were not the result of some passing misunderstanding. It had been calculated, deliberate, a structured arrangement designed to keep her in her place, away from the heart of the household, away from the power that should have been hers by right. The injustice of it all began to press in on her more sharply. She thought of the inheritance, once promised to her, now slipping further from her grasp with each passing day. She had once believed that the family's wealth, its status, its legacy, these were things she could claim, things that belonged to her. After all, her blood ran through the same veins as her siblings. Her father's name had been hers, too, but it was slowly being retracted, piece by piece. It wasn't a loud act of theft, nothing overt, but the way her father's will had been altered without her knowledge, the way her half-sister had been placed in positions of authority over household matters, was enough to tell her that she was no longer considered a true heir. The power of the family, its resources, its wealth, these were now out of reach. She had been replaced. She had been cast aside, and it was not just about material wealth, it was about her very place within the family structure. Even her marriage, once discussed with the hope of strengthening her position, had been quietly dismissed. Her father had offered the proposal to her half-sister instead, a match that would tie the family to even greater power, but for her, no such alliances had been arranged. She was a tool to be used when necessary, a face to be paraded on occasion, but never one to hold the reins of the family's future. The final blow came one morning when she entered the family's private study, where her father and the matriarch were reviewing the household accounts. She had come to discuss a matter concerning the estate's finances, her right, she had thought, as the eldest daughter of the family. But as she entered, the conversation immediately stopped. Her father did not look up from his papers, and the matriarch's sharp gaze flicked over her like a hawk assessing prey. "Ah, you're here," the matriarch said, her voice smooth but cutting. "Perhaps you can wait for your turn. We have more pressing matters to attend to." The cold dismissal in her tone pierced through the air, leaving her standing there, frozen, her words stuck in her throat. She stood still for a moment, her hands trembling at her sides. They were deciding the future of the estate, the future of the family, and yet, she had no voice in it. The decisions that shaped her life were being made without her, without even a second glance. She had been reduced to an observer in her own home, her presence a mere formality, a symbol of her fading relevance. The silence that followed was deafening. She did not protest, did not speak, for she knew that her words would not matter. She had no claim to their attention, no claim to the family's resources. Her father's approval was no longer hers to seek. Her place was no longer at the table where decisions were made. The family had chosen her half-sister, had placed her at the center of everything that once belonged to her. It was a slow, subtle process, this displacement, but now it was unmistakable. She was no longer a part of the family's future. The weight of that realization settled heavily in her chest, but there was no release, no outburst. There was only the deep, unspoken ache that lingered in her bones. She turned and left the study without another word. In the days that followed, the echoes of that moment reverberated through her every step. She no longer played her role with ease. The rituals, the careful smiles, the quiet nods, these had all been survival mechanisms, ways to keep the peace, to maintain some semblance of harmony. But now, as she walked the halls of the estate, she could feel the truth pressing in on her from all sides. It was no longer just about the wealth, the position, or the inheritance. It was about her very identity, her place in the family. The matriarch, the father, and even her siblings, they had all agreed, in their own quiet way, that she was no longer essential. She was no longer part of the family's legacy. It was a deep, unspoken wound, one that cut through her heart but left no visible mark. No one would know the depth of her pain. No one would know how she had been quietly erased from the family's story, how her rightful place had been taken from her and given to someone else. She had been replaced. And yet, she did not scream. She did not fight back in the way she longed to. Instead, she carried the pain in silence, like a heavy stone lodged deep within her chest, a stone that grew heavier with each passing day. It was a slow and subtle process, but it was clear now. The family had moved on without her. And though she had once thought she belonged, she now knew, deep down, that she had never truly had a place in their world. The matriarch, her father, and even her own siblings had made sure of that. The betrayal was not in the actions themselves, but in the quiet acceptance of them, the way they had all allowed her to fade into the background, as if she were nothing more than a forgotten memory. No one had ever told her that she was unimportant, no, it had been far worse. They had simply stopped acknowledging her presence. And in that silence, the pain grew. The truth settled deeper, and she began to understand what had been taken from her, not just her inheritance, not just her position in the family, but her very place in the world she had once believed was hers. The evening had started like all the others, calm, expected, the air thick with formality, as it always was during these family gatherings. The great hall was adorned with fine silk banners and the usual opulence, with every gesture deliberate and carefully calculated to uphold the image of unity and strength. She sat at the far end of the table, her back straight, her fingers lightly resting on the edge of the table, her presence no more than a silent shadow among the lively conversation that swirled around her. The family spoke in polite tones, discussing matters of little consequence, all of them pretending to be connected, pretending to care. Her half-sister was seated at the center, the matriarch on one side, her father opposite her. And there, in the place where she used to belong, was now only an empty chair, her seat, a symbol of her absence from the family's core. The family gathered once more for a meal, the yearly tradition where the succession of power and responsibility was subtly acknowledged. The patriarch, with his commanding presence, took his place at the head of the table, presiding over the proceedings with practiced authority. He raised his glass, his voice resounding as he made the customary toast. She had expected this, just as she had expected the placement of the seating to be as it was, no surprises, no changes. But then, as the moment stretched, her father's eye scanned the room, and without a word, his gaze slid past her, never lingering, never acknowledging her presence. The moment passed, the toast made, but the weight of it was more than she could bear. The air felt colder now, heavier with the understanding of what had just transpired. She was no longer even visible to him, not even a passing glance, not even a momentary recognition. And yet, she had already known this truth for so long. It had just taken a simple, fleeting action, an unspoken snub, to make it undeniable. She could feel it, the shift that had been in the air for months, years even. She was being relegated to the margins, quietly erased from the family narrative. Her father's gaze, once filled with pride and affection, now passed over her like a cloud moving swiftly across the sky, imperceptible, indifferent. She wanted to speak, to rise from her chair, to voice the hurt she had carried in silence for so long, but she did not. Instead, she remained seated, her posture unyielding, her heart heavy. Her sister, on the other hand, sat upright, her back straight, her eyes fixed on their father as she received his praise, his acknowledgement. It was her now, not her, who commanded the family's attention. A small, insignificant gesture to most, but to her, it felt like the final confirmation of her insignificance. The conversation continued, but the weight of that one moment clung to her like a chain. She didn't speak, didn't engage. She simply listened, feeling the distance between herself and the rest of the family stretch farther and farther. The night dragged on, each passing moment a reminder of her fading presence, a reminder of the fact that she was no longer a part of this world, this family's heart. As the dinner ended and the guests began to depart, she stood, slowly, deliberately, and walked toward the door. No one stopped her. No one called her name. She passed through the hall, her footsteps muffled on the polished floor, the quiet solitude of the corridor greeting her like an old friend. She didn't turn back, didn't look at the others as they continued their quiet conversations, pretending that nothing had changed. The shift had already occurred. The door closed behind her with a soft click, the final sound of her departure from the family's central narrative. She had not been physically thrown out, no loud words had been spoken. It had all happened in the silence, in the subtlety of their actions. And yet, it was in that silence that she felt the full force of the betrayal. It was not just her seat that had been taken from her. It was not just her voice that had been ignored. It was her very right to be at the center of this family, to hold any place in its future, that had been silently revoked. The truth had finally settled in her heart, clear and unshakable. She was no longer the daughter of this family. She was no longer a part of its legacy. Her place had been stolen from her, not with force or drama, but with quiet indifference. With a coldness that left no room for rebuttal. She stepped into the garden, her breathing slow and measured, her thoughts racing behind the calm facade. The moonlight reflected off the still surface of the pond, casting long shadows that seemed to stretch out before her. For the first time, she felt completely alone in this world she had once believed was her own. She was not angry. Anger was too noisy, too disruptive. Instead, there was only a deep, aching sadness that pressed against her chest, as though her heart were slowly being crushed beneath the weight of the truth. And yet, in that silence, in that unbearable quiet, something within her began to shift. She had been silenced for so long, had allowed herself to be pushed to the edges of the family's power. But now, she felt it, the faintest spark, barely a flicker, but undeniable. It was not the anger she felt in the past. It was something colder, something more controlled. She had been erased, but she was not gone. And in that moment, she realized that the choice was hers, to remain invisible, to accept her place at the edge, or to take back what was hers, what had always been hers, even if it meant tearing down the walls that had been built around her. The days passed in a blur, each one blending into the next with a quiet, suffocating heaviness. She spent her mornings in silence, watching the light filter through the paper-thin windows of her room, the faint dust mote swirling in the beams. The house had never seemed so vast, so empty, as it did now. Once, the hallways had echoed with the bustle of servants and the gentle murmur of family voices, but now the only sound she heard was her own steps, measured, deliberate, echoing off the cold stone floors. There was no greeting from the servants as she passed. No bow, no offer of tea. It was as if she had become part of the scenery, blending into the background, a shadow in the house she had once ruled. The change was subtle, insidious, but undeniable. She moved through the estate with a quiet dignity, though it was not for lack of pain. It was a quiet surrender, a resignation she had not yet allowed herself to fully acknowledge. She had not spoken out. She had not confronted them. But the weight of the truth had settled on her like a mantle she could not cast off. Her place in the family had been taken from her, not by force, but by quiet, relentless pressure. The rituals that had once included her were now held without her. Meetings, decisions, discussions that shaped the family's future took place without even a glance toward her. She was no longer even needed in the background. Her father's presence had become a distant thing, and the matriarch's sharp eyes no longer bothered to acknowledge her. And yet, she moved through the halls, still wearing the mask she had learned to wear, her face a calm picture of the composure she no longer felt. She walked past the old family chambers, her fingers brushing against the cold wood of the doors. Once, these doors had opened for her, welcoming her into spaces she could command, places where her authority had been acknowledged. Now, they were closed, the rooms locked away from her, and the space where her belongings had been kept was now filled with the personal items of her half-sister. The bedding, the furniture, everything had been rearranged to suit her. The change was visible even in the smallest of details, the position of the desk, the placement of the scrolls, the arrangement of the tea set. Everything had been moved to make room for the new center of attention. She had no right to feel this hurt, this sense of loss. She had been a silent observer, a bystander to her own fate for so long. But now, as she stood there, looking at the changes in the room, it felt as though she had been erased completely from the fabric of the house. She had been replaced in her own home, and it was not just the space that had been rearranged, it was the very air she breathed, thick with the knowledge that she no longer belonged. The servants had always been polite, but now there was an added coldness in their manner. When she passed by them in the halls, there was no longer the faintest inclination to bow their heads, no longer the respectful nods they once gave her. They simply moved around her as if she were invisible. Even the way they spoke to her had changed. No longer were the words offered with any warmth, but with a polite indifference, as though she were just another figure passing through their lives, no more important than the furniture. It was not cruelty that marked their behavior, it was something worse. It was the quiet acceptance of her absence, the unspoken understanding that she was no longer needed in their world. The most telling moment came when, during a late afternoon meeting in the family's inner court, the matriarch had glanced her way and then turned her eyes quickly to her sister, who had been seated at her side, a favored position once meant for her. The words exchanged between them were not harsh. They were not loud. They were simply dismissive. Her sister's name had been called with all the warmth of the family's attention, while hers had barely been acknowledged. No one looked at her when they spoke of matters that concerned the family's future. The decisions were made without her input, and the arrangements were carried out without her involvement. She had become irrelevant in the eyes of the very people who had once relied on her, who had once spoken her name with pride. And yet, as the meeting continued, she remained silent. She did not speak. She did not rise to claim her place. Instead, she simply watched, her eyes slowly dimming as she realized that her time in the center was gone. The recognition she once received for her quiet strength had been transferred to her half-sister, who was now the household's true figurehead. She rose from her seat and left without a word, her steps measured and composed, but inside, she was unravelling. The hallway seemed to stretch on forever, each step a silent protest against the new order of things. She walked past the ancestral tablets, the markers of the family's lineage, and stopped in front of them. The dust that had gathered on the tablet seemed like an unspoken metaphor for the history she had once been a part of, a history that was now slipping away. Her name, once etched in the family records, now seemed like a distant memory, fading from the pages of time. She looked up at the portraits of her ancestors, their solemn faces staring down at her, offering no comfort, no recognition. She did not belong here anymore. She was no longer a part of the family's future, and the realization was so final, so absolute, that it cut deeper than any word could. She turned away, her heart heavy, her body numb. She walked back to her chambers, and as she stepped inside, she closed the door behind her with a soft click. There was no turning back now. The mask she had worn for so long had finally slipped, and the reality of her position had become too clear to deny. She was no longer the daughter of this house, no longer the rightful heir. The family had moved on without her, and she had been left behind, a ghost in the halls of her own home. The house felt quieter now, the silence in its halls not just an absence of sound, but a reflection of the emptiness she had come to understand. She moved with deliberation, her steps slow but certain as she made her way to the study, where the family records were kept, where the fate of the household had been decided for generations. The ink on the scrolls had long since dried, the names and dates immortalized in black against the delicate rice paper, but now, those names seemed irrelevant, distant. She had never been one for idle thoughts, and now she had no time for sentiment. She could no longer afford to look back. She sat at the desk, her hand steady as she unrolled the ancient scrolls, one by one. The weight of them felt different now, once they had held her future, her inheritance. Now they felt like relics, pieces of a past that was no longer hers to claim. She flicked through them, her fingers tracing the fine script, but her eyes moved quickly, absorbing only what was necessary. The marriage contracts, the will of her father, the agreements that had been made without her knowledge, the promises that had been broken, they were all here, etched in ink and sealed with the family's crest. She paused only for a moment, her breath shallow as she read the familiar words. Nothing had changed. She had been excluded, her place taken by someone else. The decision was already made, and there was no room for her in the family's plans. She folded the scroll carefully, setting it aside before reaching for another. The quiet was oppressive, but she could not afford to be distracted. The room around her felt cold now, as if it had grown distant from her. The familiar furniture, the worn wooden shelves, even the heavy curtains that once seemed to protect her now felt like barriers. She had been left behind. But she would no longer play the part of the obedient daughter, the silent observer. She had learned, in the silence, that she was her own master. Slowly, she rose from the desk and made her way to the wardrobe where her personal belongings had been kept. She opened the heavy doors, her fingers grazing the silk robes that had once been her pride. She ran her hand over the fabric, but there was no nostalgia in the gesture. These were no longer hers. She had long since stopped wearing them with joy. They were part of the illusion she had once lived in, the life she had once believed was hers. She picked up the embroidered fan her mother had given her, its edges worn from years of use, and for the first time, she set it down without hesitation. She didn't need it anymore. The fan, like the rest of her belongings, was a symbol of the person she had been, the person who had been pushed aside, erased. She reached for the small box that held her dowry, her wedding gifts, once a promise of the future. The jade, the silk, the treasures meant to secure her place in the family, now, they meant nothing. She opened the box, her eyes scanning over the items, but she felt no attachment to them. They were just things. The only thing that mattered now was what she could reclaim. Her eyes moved over the room, taking in the space she had once ruled, now rearranged, now occupied by someone else. The desk, the shelves, the space by the window, it all belonged to someone else. It was no longer hers to control, no longer hers to influence. Her life, once filled with possibilities, had been quietly steered into a corner. But now, she knew the truth. She would no longer wait for the family to grant her space, to allow her to return to the center. She was done with that. She reached for the key to the family's private rooms, the key she had always kept at her side, and for the first time, she placed it in her pocket with purpose. The key, like everything else, had been part of the illusion. But now, it was her key, her claim. As she stood there in the room, her hands clasped in front of her, she felt the shift deep within her. She had been pushed aside, but she was not powerless. There was still strength in her, strength that had been waiting in silence, strength that had been buried beneath the weight of duty and expectation. But now, she could see clearly. The house, the family, it was no longer her home. Her place, once guaranteed, had been stolen from her, but she would take it back. She would not ask for permission. She would not beg for recognition. She would simply take what was rightfully hers. She turned, walking slowly to the door, her movements deliberate, her mind already working through the next steps. The family's power, their carefully constructed hierarchy, would not hold her forever. She had already begun to see the cracks, the small fissures in the foundation they had built. There were alliances to be formed, decisions to be made, and there was no longer any room for doubt. She stepped into the hall, her eyes scanning the familiar space with a new understanding. The servants moved around her, but no longer did they look past her. They acknowledged her now, their eyes no longer filled with indifference. She did not stop to speak to them. She did not need their approval. Her place in the family had changed, but now, it was her decision to make. She moved through the corridors with confidence, each step a silent affirmation of the new path she had chosen. There would be no more waiting, no more acceptance of the position they had forced on her. She would reclaim her place, her voice, and her power. The game had changed, and she was no longer a passive player. She was the one who would shape the future, and the family would have to reckon with it. The days had passed in quiet succession, each one blending into the next, and she had become accustomed to the stillness of her days. The estate, once full of promise and life, now seemed distant, almost foreign, its grandeur a facade she no longer wished to claim. The rituals continued, gatherings, feasts, decisions made behind closed doors, but she no longer participated, no longer waited for a place at the table. Her presence, once central to the family's future, was now nothing more than a whisper in the wind. Her father's voice, once so familiar, no longer called her name, and her half-sister had taken the seat at his side, as expected. But she did not feel the ache of loss anymore. The emptiness that had once overwhelmed her now seemed like a distant memory, a hollow space she had learned to fill with something else, something that no longer demanded acknowledgement or validation from those who had once ruled her world. Her focus had shifted, her attention turned inward. The family's power, their wealth, and their legacy had no hold over her anymore. She did not wish to reclaim the position that had been stolen from her. That life, that identity, was no longer hers to claim. Instead, she had found her own path, a quiet path that did not require the approval of anyone in this house. The decision had been made. She no longer needed the family's wealth, their titles, or their approval. They had already made it clear that she was no longer part of their future. What they had taken, she no longer cared to retrieve. The key to her own freedom had always been within her reach, and now she grasped it firmly. It had not been a loud decision, nor a public one. It had been a quiet understanding that the true power was hers to create, not to reclaim. She turned to the final piece of her plan, the family's official records. The deed to the estate, the documents of inheritance, all of it had been prepared long ago, set in motion by those who had assumed she would never question them. But she had already made her move. The wealth, the land, the properties, they were no longer tied to her name. She had quietly removed herself from the family structure, severing the ties that had once bound her to their world. It was not an act of rebellion, it was an act of release. She did not need to fight for the life they had tried to deny her. Instead, she quietly let go. In the late hours of the night, she visited the family vault, where the documents of ownership and succession were kept. There, in the dim light, she carefully checked each parchment, ensuring that the last of her ties to the family's wealth were sealed. She placed the papers back into their rightful place, locking them away with a finality that did not need to be spoken aloud. The decisions had already been made. The life she had once known, the one she had been forced to live, was no longer hers. And for the first time in years, she felt a strange sense of calm wash over her. The house, the family, and all that they had once offered her were no longer a part of her life. She had stepped away from it all, not in anger, but in a quiet acceptance of what had come to pass. As she walked through the hallways of the family estate one last time, the weight of her decision did not press down on her as it once had. The echoes of the past, the whispers of what could have been, had faded. She passed by her father's study, the door slightly ajar, and for the briefest moment, she considered stepping inside. But she did not. Instead, she continued on, her steps measured and sure. There was no need to revisit the past, no need to seek closure. What had been done was done. The family would continue on without her, just as they had always intended. And she, too, would continue, on her own terms, in her own time. As she reached the outer gates of the estate, she paused for a moment, the night air cool against her skin. The world outside awaited her, a world where she could now walk freely, unburdened by the chains of a past that had never truly been hers. With a single, final breath, she stepped through the gates, leaving behind the family she had once belonged to, and the life they had tried to dictate for her. There was no dramatic farewell, no final words to mark the occasion. There was only silence, the kind that filled the space between one life and the next. As she disappeared into the night, the estate behind her seemed to fade into the shadows, the house she had once called home now just a memory. A new chapter had begun, and she was the author of her own story now.